one concept. That is all. Just one single concept that for centuries and even millennia past has dominated our history across the ages. Yes, civilization is a big playing point of this, but it's also driven by other things. This is a concept that has only very recently gone out of fashion. The Romans had one, the Greeks had one to an extent, and even the recent European empires of more modern times will have and will continue to have a profound effect on our history and the way we live our lives, the scars of which can still be seen on maps and across the world to this day. But for now though, we're going to start again at the beginning, with the very first of these empires, the first proper empire in history, and the beginnings, you could say, of monarchy, imperialism, a hierarchical form of government. This, my friends, is the Akkadian Empire. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, my fellow historians, and welcome back to A History of Humanity as part of the Grand Portfolio. Now, when we last left off, civilization had just begun. We have the first city-states in the region that was then known as Sumer in what is now modern-day Iraq, surrounding the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Up until this point, the only forms of government or society that existed in our modern sense were the Sumerian city-states, namely Ur, Uruk, Lagash and Nippur, to name a few. But towards the end of our last episode, I spoke of a certain man known as Lougehrigse. Now, that wasn't his full name, don't forget. Lugal means great man or great leader in the ancient Sumerian language. We can't be entirely 100% when we pinpoint what language it was that this was in. It could have been Aramaic, Sumerian, Akkadian. It could have been anything. I mean, don't forget, we're talking about... Crikey, we are talking about almost 5,000 years ago now. These guys were ancient, even to the Romans, even to Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and these were even before Tutankhamun and Ramesses times. Now, don't forget what I said last episode, in the fact that up until this point there were no real huge complex governments or countries or nations with territories as you see across the globe today. There were just these city-states in the region known as Sumer, which linked as part of the Fertile Crescent as it is known today. Now, up until this point, all these city-states weren't united at all. They acted more or less as independent countries, independent governments, very much like the Ionian Greeks, the Greeks that you're more familiar with, brought us such tales as the Iliad, the adventures of Odysseus, and the trials of Hercules. Now, at this point, Lougehrigse, leader of the Sumerian city-state of Umma. Now, Lougehrigse was not a king from the start. He inherited the title of Ensi, ruler of the city of Umma, from his father. Before this, he was the high priest of the goddess Nisaba, the patron goddess of the Sumerian city. Of course, we learnt last time that Sumerian priests in their temples had quite significant political power and influence in the cities and city-states within which they operated and resided. This is why that would tie into Lougehrigse eventually becoming the ruler of Umma from being the high priest of Nisaba. But this was a man, it seemed, who was not satisfied with just being the political leader and figurehead of just the city-state of Umma. No, it seems he wanted more. Power-hungry. He set out on a journey of conquest across Sumer. From his home and domain of the city-state of Umma, Lougehrigse conquered across the Sumerian landscape. With expansionist thoughts on his mind, he roamed across the land and conquered Ur, Lagash, Girsu and Narsa, eventually bringing them all under his control. However, it must be said that his rule was not looked on favourably by the local populations. It seems that the city of Lagash in particular weren't really the biggest fans of old Lougehrigse. Of course, I mean, who would be fans of the people that conquered them? I mean, all you've got to do is just look at it throughout history. I mean, whenever somebody gets conquered, it never really ends well for the conquerors, does it? Or those that have been conquered. Okay, that's a bit confusing, but you get what I'm trying to say. Lougehrigse was not painted in a good light by the... what would you call them? I suppose the Lagashites, the people who inhabited the city of Lagash. We have in fact evidence of said misdeeds or sins committed by Lougehrigse in the city of Lagash. We have a stone tablet that dates back to around the time of Lougehrigse's conquest of Sumer. Written, well, we're not sure entirely who this may have been written by because this was so long ago, but a stone tablet exists inscribed in cuneiform, the basic written language I spoke about in my last episode, that details the so-called atrocities that Lougehrigse inflicted on his newly conquered city of Lagash. Quote, "To the Antasura temple he set fire, and its silver and lapis lazuli he bundled off. The palace of Tirash he plundered, the smaller Abzu he plundered, the dye of Enlil and the dye of Utu he plundered, the Ahush he plundered, and its silver and lapis lazuli he bundled off." Close quote. So as you can see from what we've just seen from the stone tablet written by the Lagashites is that they weren't particularly as ecstatic as Lougehrigse was at having the city of Lagash conquered. This is possibly one of the only records we have of Lougehrigse's conquest of the region of Sumer. However, and you'll find this throughout history as we go along, that once somebody's completed their conquest, achieved their ambition, become king of the mountain, toppled yet another god, there will always be something lurking in the shadows. There will always be one thing hiding just beyond the edge of their vision. Perhaps wielding the future, or wielding a certainty. And to the north of Sumer, to the north of Lougehrigse's new kingdom, one man had ambitions greater than our Lugal of Sumer. No, this man had simpler beginnings than Zagesi himself, but you could say he was far more ambitious. To the north of Sumer lay a city known as Agade, or Akkad. Now, this is where it gets a bit tricky because historians still are yet to pinpoint the exact location of the city of Akkad. We simply know it was somewhere in the region of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, Mesopotamia again, but exactly where along those river lines, we don't know, and we may never know. This was so far back, remember, that we can't really be 100% certain of anything. Well, there are times in the times when you're 100% certain, especially in history, there aren't very many of them, even recent events. I mean, take the First World War, for example. Been in the news a hell of a lot lately over the last half to decade or so, because of course it's the centenary. Now, this war still has such profound effect on our everyday lives, but historians are not 100% certain on how far back the causes of it go. But as in the case of the Akkadian Empire and the Sumerian city-states themselves, historians are perhaps even more unsure because there's very little evidence left. And I mean, well, written records aren't as up-to-date and to a high standard as they are in today's world. Not only that, if you imagine the amount of conflicts and wars that have dotted the area for the past 5,000 years or so, then you can imagine a lot of evidence, any written records at all, would have been destroyed. Which is why you can understand it would be so difficult to pinpoint the locations of some cities, such as Akkad. However, we've got to say that Akkad itself must have existed, because there wouldn't be records of Sargon I, the Conqueror, the first emperor of the Akkadian Empire, and in retrospect there wouldn't be an Akkadian Empire itself now, would there? Because it would need a starting point or a founding point, which it gets its namesake from. Okay, so I mentioned Sargon I. Now, Lougehrigse had set up his kingdom. It was all fine and dandy, hooray! He just conquered all the Sumerian city-states and brought them under one nation and one government. Perhaps, maybe even, you had the world's first country as you see it today. However, his ambitions were outweighed and outcompeted by a man from a city who lived far to the north of Sumer. This man was Sargon. He was the first king and the first emperor of the Akkadian Empire, the first empire in all of history. Now, the story goes that Sargon's beginnings are actually mostly unknown. The earliest part of his tale that we know is that he was found at the side of a river in the city-state of Kish by, as it happened, the king of Kish's royal gardener. So the gardener took him in and raised him as his own. It's said in myth that Sargon was possibly descended from King Gilgamesh, but of course this could probably be a bit sketchy, and Sargon may even be the embodiment or the inspiration for the personality of King Gilgamesh in the epic of the same name. Right, going back to my point. That is the earliest instance of Sargon I's beginning that we have. Now, Sargon was raised by this gardener in the city of Kish, eventually working his way up within the royal courts to become the king's cupbearer. Now, you've got to understand, in ancient times, the cupbearer of the king is similar to that of back in the Middle Ages when you had the groom of the stool. Except the groom of the stool is a far worse job. I'll let you go and research that one, because although it was a job of high esteem, it wasn't very pleasant for the person involved, I can imagine. Okay, so you've got to imagine the cupbearer would pour wine or other drinks for the king. I mean, clues in the name, it's obvious. This would be a position, quite a position of high trust and esteem within the royal court, because you trust the wrong person, all they have to do is just slip their hand over some cyanide or arsenic, sprinkle it in the wine, and the king is no more. So you could say that Sargon I may have been a trustworthy man. Could have been. I'm trying to make this as little a sweeping statement as possible. Or maybe he was cunning, rather deceptive, in the sense that eventually Sargon would overthrow this king and take his throne for his own. Being a king back in ancient times, or in fact any time in history, was never really as set in stone or stable as you see kings and queens around the world today. I mean, you don't exactly see one king trying to overthrow another, or their servants trying to off them at any point. Well, this, and as you'll see as we go along through history, is quite commonplace. And as for Ur-Zababa, the king of Kish, of which Sargon served as cupbearer, he would learn this lesson the hard way. As many of us in life learn lessons the hard way all the time, believe me. I'm sick of it as much as any of you are. But anyway, Sargon would teach Ur-Zababa the brutal reality of being a king at any given point in history, except for, well, the present day, I suppose. This brutal reality would be that, obviously, as I said before, your position is never really set in stone. All it takes is a dagger, a bit of poison, a stray arrow, a bullet, anything, and just like that, your reign is no more. However, as with the case of Ur-Zababa, it gets a bit fuzzy. We're not really sure if Sargon led a people's uprising, if he, in fact, there is a theory that he went over to Lougehrigse and in fact invited the Lugal to come and invade Kish and help him overthrow Ur-Zababa. But this is going so far back, remember, that we may never know for sure. But in any case, the throne of Kish was now in the hands of Sargon, or should I now say, King Sargon I, the first ruler of what would one day become the Akkadian Empire. So, wow, we are finally all caught up. That took a while, didn't it? But at least you have all the background story necessary to begin to understand what comes next. Because Sargon was now the king of perhaps one of the mightiest cities in the region, Kish. But he wanted more. He wanted so much more than just what lay within his city walls. He knew there was more out there, a world that could be conquered, cities brought under his control. And so, against what was the normality back then, kings or local leaders made conquests in order to gain resources, or perhaps gain influence over a few pastures, a few fields, just more bounty to add to your treasure pile, so then you could ensure that your people wouldn't starve and then get angry, then stage a revolt and attempt to kill you. Instead, Sargon did not conquer just for this. He conquered for himself. Could be that this was perhaps the first instance in all of history where a leader and a ruler would set out on a journey of conquest for his own ambitions and his own desires, perhaps sidelining the thought of his own people just to satisfy his ambition, or perhaps his curiosity. Maybe he conquered simply to see and rule all that there was. Now, of course, you have to understand that there's perhaps a vast difference between what we see as the world today and what they saw as the world back then. Because back then, obviously, there was no massive, interconnected, knowledgeable world of which we live in today. We're very lucky to have the concept of the world as we know it, as an entire globe, as an entire planet, as an entire interconnected system of countries and nations trading with each other and cooperating most of the time. Well, instead back then it was quite different, because they didn't know exactly how far the world stretched, how far the horizon could go before you reached the open ocean. And so, after overthrowing Ur-Zababa, Sargon I went on to confront his biggest rival in the region. That would be our old friend Lougehrigse. You're probably sick and tired of hearing that name by now, but I'm afraid he is one of the key figures of the age and area we're talking about. Because Lougehrigse, as you will remember, at this point controlled all of Sumer, all of the Sumerian city-states. Kish lay just outside of Lougehrigse's boundaries. And with the overthrow of Ur-Zababa in the city, Lougehrigse recognised that Sargon was now a major threat. He had overthrown a king, and he now controlled a city, which meant he now controlled resources, and even more concernedly, he controlled an army. Of course, now, like I said, if you are a king or an emperor, your position is never really safe. You may feel like you're immortal when you're a king or an emperor, but like the rest of us, you still have a heartbeat. There is still blood in your veins, of which the beat can be stopped and the blood spilled. And Lougehrigse, as he watched Kish fall to Sargon, was reminded all too well of this reality. Perhaps it was the very shiver of death's cold exhale tickling the back of his neck that perhaps persuaded him to undergo what happened next. Perhaps driven by fear and anxiety of death or exile, or the end of his hold over Sumer, Lougehrigse would march his armies on the city of Kish to put down Sargon before he could become an even greater threat than he already had. But it may have been too little too late. Sargon met Lougehrigse on the field of battle, not far from the city of Kish itself. And unbelievably still, Sargon won. He defeated Lougehrigse and his armies in battle, and therefore proved his right to have a hold over the region of Sumer and perhaps all of Mesopotamia combined at this point. With that, Sargon thought to put Lougehrigse through what was then considered one of the ultimate humiliations for a Lugal or leader or king at that time. After this disastrous defeat for Lougehrigse, Sargon tied a rope around Lugal-Zagesse's neck. Or perhaps you couldn't even call him Lugal at this point. He had been defeated by Sargon. Maybe at this point he was just Zagesse and not Lugal, as he had once been. To inflict upon him the ultimate humiliation, Sargon paraded Lugal, or rather just Zagesse, tying a rope around his neck, and no, not hanging him, dragged him to the city of Nippur, which was sacred to the great god Enlil, king and master of the pantheon of ancient Sumerian gods. And, with his bonds drawn and tied, forced Zagesse to march through the gate of Enlil with his head bowed, as an example to all the gods and perhaps all the known world that this once mighty Lugal, this king, who perhaps, it seemed for a little while, had been chosen by the gods to rule over Sumer, was driven back through Enlil's gate in humiliation and defeat, perhaps further driving home to the people of Sumer and all the city-states it beheld that Sargon was the king that the gods favoured. Now, you could call this a bit of propaganda, that he forced Lugal-Zagesse, or the former Lugal, through the gate of Enlil in order to drive home, this is what the gods wanted, this is what Enlil wants, this is what he favours me and not this husk of a man you see before you. It can be said then that Sargon was by no means unintelligent. Perhaps by doing this, he was crafty. Very, very clever in the way that he drove home the message that Zagesse, your reign is no more. Or perhaps he just did this for religious reasons, simply to appease the gods, because as I said in the previous episode, the Sumerian gods were, let's just say, not the most positive of gods that we will come across. Remember that it was said that Enlil washed away all of mankind in a flood simply because they woke him up from his afternoon nap with their non-stop partying. But, of course, we will never really know. That is up for interpretation. You can take that however you want. Did he do it for religious reasons, or simply just as a propaganda move to try and cement his rule among the local populace? Okay, so enough with this little brief summary. Where were we? Ah yes, that was right. So, Sargon has just conquered Sumer. He's just forced Lugal-Zagesse into the ultimate humiliation, but we're not entirely sure of what happened to Zagesse after that. Maybe he was executed, maybe he was just exiled, or maybe he simply ran away and became a goat herder somewhere. We will never truly know, because after his defeat, he just drops out of the records. Gone like a little speck on the wind. Because it is true that history is indeed written by the victors, and this time it would be. For Sargon, it appears, was not content with just conquering Sumer. Oh no, he knew there was much more to be had. Don't forget, his city of Kish was outside of Sumer itself, but still inside the region of Mesopotamia. He knew, of course, that there was much more than just Sumer and Kish. But before he did that, he built a great city known as Akkad, or Agade. We don't know exactly where it is, but we do know it must have been in Mesopotamia, because Sargon needed a base from which to assert his power and launch his conquests and expeditions across the far regions. No, it seems Sumer was absolutely delicious. He must have given, if there was TripAdvisor, he would have given that place a 5-star because it elevated him to king status, cemented his rule, and got rid of his rival. 5 stars all in one, great service. Great service. I especially like the way I was able to defeat Lougehrigse in battle, thank you very much. Okay. Back to real history and not buggering about. Okay. So after this, his capital city of Akkad had been built, and he dedicated it to the goddess Ishtar, or Inanna, 2 names by which the same goddess were both known. He took this goddess as his divine symbol, his patron and his protector. And with Sumer under his belt, well, I say under his belt, but hold on a minute. The truth is, with Lougehrigse's reign over Sumer, each city had still a leader, rather a client leader that would pay homage to the Lugal of all of Sumer. And this nobility were not really best pleased by someone else from outside coming in and deposing the man who had given them power, who had kept their statuses intact. And so before he could go out to conquer the known world, Sargon had first to subdue the nobility. And not just that, to subdue his own working people. And so he went on a journey of conquest, not just happy with offing Lougehrigse and then simply saying, oh look, I have a hold over Sumer now, I'm just going to sit back and relax on my sunbed. No. He went on yet another journey of conquest throughout the Sumerian region, taking the old cities of Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur. He conquered them all, and made sure to drive home the message even further. I am your king now. I have climbed to the highest peak. I see no king up here. Except me. Yeah, that guy falling down the hillside, that's nobody, forget about him, that's just Sargons. He was hanging around this palace here just a while ago. Don't worry about it. But, anyway, he went on a sort of, I guess, maybe it's a reconquista of sorts, but that's a bit far-fetched. So in order to subdue all the surrounding city-states, he went on a journey of conquest, conquered all the notable cities that we've learned about so far. And with that, he drove home the message that he was an almighty, powerful ruler. I think the historian Bauer puts it best in what she writes. Quote, with the Mesopotamian plain under his control, Sargon set out to build an empire which would stretch beyond Mesopotamia. He led his soldiers on campaign after campaign after campaign. Sargon, the king of Kish, reads one of his tablets, triumphed in 34 battles. Close quote. Well, you could see this as another piece of propaganda, saying that somebody triumphed in 34 battles, not describing their difficulties, any trouble they got into, nothing like that. Maybe perhaps was a way to, in the common people's eyes, make out Sargon to be some kind of god, an almighty warrior that could sweep aside his enemies like brushing dirt off a table. However, it could be said that this is propaganda in order to put the common folk in line, because that is mostly where your revolts and rebellions tend to start off. It could be said that maybe Sargon knew this, and in so doing wrote all these tablets describing his victories, his triumphs, his mighty campaigns and all his conquests, in order to basically spread a message of perhaps fear, not only fear as well, but respect for him among the people he had newly conquered, in order to sort of ensure that they wouldn't rise up. And I suppose you could say that even the story of his beginning may have even been fabricated. We don't know for sure. That he was simply found at a riverside and raised by the local palace gardener. Humble beginnings, in order to appeal to the common people that he was one of them and he had risen up to take and conquer kingdoms and cities. To perhaps help the common people understand that this guy's friendly, he's on their side. And that also echoes back to the tablet found that I quoted earlier, which painted Lougehrigse as an absolute monster. Something not even human that would dare to steal from the buildings of the gods, these temples. He took the jewels from these temples, remember, that were offerings to the gods. Perhaps it was propaganda to paint Lougehrigse as a monster, and then this tablet was written to paint Sargon I, this king of Kish who had come in and suddenly conquered Sumer, as a hero, who had killed the monster, who had slain a true beast. Perhaps what we find detailing Sargon, Lougehrigse, and the Akkadian Empire, its beginnings at least, may have been meant simply as propaganda, so that the common people would fall in line and not revolt. So the only obstacle would simply be the leaders of these cities themselves. And Sargon did take care of this. Like I said, he went on a journey of conquest, campaigning all throughout the region of Sumer. He defeated king after king after king, until any remnant of Lougehrigse's reign or legacy was gone. But as I said, Sargon was still hungry. No, he just had a banquet, the main course being Sumer, and now it was time for dessert. The rest of Mesopotamia, and even further beyond that. For Sargon would turn his gaze north. But first, there was a bit of a problem. You see, obviously, Sargon, Lougehrigse, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Mesopotamians, they obviously weren't the only people on Earth. The Arabian Peninsula and the Middle and Near East, if you look at it on a map, may look small in comparison to everything else, but if you just look at the area, it is huge. Now, of course, there were other peoples out there. There were the Elamites, the Amorites, the Gutians. All of these peoples were semi-nomadic tribes. And Sargon wanted to continue his journey of conquest. Now, if a strange person were to somehow come along and take away all your farmland and start telling you how and what to do, then I think it's safe to say you'd be a bit miffed. I mean, look at it all throughout history. When hasn't there been an instance where somebody's conquered a new land and somebody somewhere has been pissed off about it? Can't charm them all with propaganda, I'm afraid, Sargon. You're going to have to go on another conquest. So, with this in mind, he took his army south and subdued the Elamites and brought them under his rule. Now, the Elamites inhabited the area around the Persian Gulf. This is a slight estimate because you wouldn't really be able to track their movements specifically, But they inhabited the region which in modern times is around the Persian Gulf and could be known today as Kuwait or parts of southwestern Iran. In the modern day sense, just to put a bit of substance into it that would help us understand where the Elamites were and where Sargon's campaigns took him. And with that in mind, he controlled nearly the entirety of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But there was a bit to the north that he did not yet control, another city, not part of Sumer and not yet under Sargon's domain. Yes, this was the city of Mari, in still what is now today Iraq. Much of Sargon's empire up until this point was in Iraq, Kuwait, and a small bit of Iran, where the Elamites resided, don't forget. Next, ranging further north still, he campaigned on to the city of Ashur, even further north now, as Bauer again writes, quote, "He ranged even farther north and asserted his rule over the small city of Nineveh. Sargon may have even invaded Asia Minor." Close quote. Now, for those of you who don't know, Asia Minor is today the modern Republic of Turkey. Or well, pretty much all of it falls within the borders of modern day Turkey. So he came from... Alright, so let's picture this and map it out. In modern day terms, he started off in what is now perhaps central or southern Iraq, conquered his way to Kuwait, went further north still, and perhaps even conquered as far north as southern Turkey. Don't forget, nobody at all in history up until this point had attempted something this ambitious. This was huge for the time, and perhaps it was to the common people that Sargon was the impression of a god on earth, because he had successfully undertaken all these conquests, he had overthrown a head of state, two in fact. You would have no idea how much power, or how much impressionable power that would project onto the people he ruled. And he didn't even stop there. It is speculated among historians that instead of going further north, he turned west. No, he didn't go to Europe. Get that idea out of your head, he did not go to Europe. Sorry, it would be nice to say that Europe's story got started this early on, but I'm afraid it didn't. Europeans were still living in mud huts, and some of which were still hunter-gatherers. Perhaps. But what he did do was, his expeditions next took him further west and north, where he encountered a new nomadic tribe that some of you may have heard of. This tribe being the Amorites, who were said to inhabit parts of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, around the Jordan River. These peoples were still nomadic and said to be wild and savage, perhaps even uncivilized. But that's more of a derogatory term, and let's not go there. So, the Amorites were thought to be a very strong and muscular people who not only ranged around the Middle East, but ranged to most of the lands west of the Caspian Sea. And these peoples are even described as so strong and brutish in the Bible. I mean, the Amorites I'm talking about could also refer to the Amorites in the Bible, because as written in Genesis 10:16 as part of the Bible, the Amorites were described as these highlanders who inhabit the descendants of Canaan who inhabited the land of Canaan. But the Bible describes them as giants. So, I think it can't go without saying that maybe we need to take that bit with a pinch of salt at least. But, anyway, Sargon encountered the Amorites in the areas known today as Syria and Lebanon, which means Sargon wanted a Mediterranean holiday. And so, in order to get to those lovely resorts, he conquered his way all the way to the Syrian coast on the Mediterranean. Of course he bloody didn't. God, I don't know really what I'm doing. But, anyway, so Sargon had now reached the Mediterranean. And now, looking at that empire, it's pretty damn big. He now has the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in his pocket, he has a coastline on the Persian Gulf, and he now has a coastline on the Mediterranean coast. The Mediterranean coast, perhaps another cradle of civilization, as we will later learn when we get more into the mid to late Bronze Age civilizations, but we won't go there today. But anyway, Sargon's rule now seemed unbreachable, undeniable. So what do you do once it's all done? Once you have no more conquests and there are no more worlds to conquer? What do you do then? Well, after your realm is secure, you go out and you make some dosh. Now, by this point, Sargon now had particularly a coastline on the Persian Gulf. He could now build ports. And this is where we get trading, and this is where all the cash comes in. Because now, Sargon could really get down to business, and so could the Akkadian Empire as a whole. Mesopotamia itself is a breadbasket, meaning you can produce an absolute arse ton of wheat and other crops used to make bread, and at this point in history, food as a basic resource is still incredibly valuable, because you have these cities springing up, you have civilizations, you need to keep them fed, or suddenly you've got somebody with a pitchfork and a torch trying to smash your door in. At this point in history, there was another civilization. Not in Mesopotamia, not in Sumer, not in anywhere in the Middle East. This was even further east than that. You may have heard of this one, you may not. The Indus River Valley civilization. And they too had been getting down to business. For with food surpluses, particularly in the Akkadian Empire now that it controlled the entire Mesopotamian breadbasket, it could now afford to sell spare food in order to import luxury goods. The first trade, the first instance of luxury, maybe you could call it designer goods, perhaps. From Anatolia, there could be traded silver from the silver mines. Not only that, but from the Himalayan regions nearing the Indus River Valley civilization, the Indus peoples could sell lapis lazuli from the mines in the mountains. Not only that, but perhaps even, wait for it, spices. And and as a European myself, I think I can speak for all Europeans when I say spices are amazing. I mean, suddenly you can sell all this wheat and all this delicious bread, and in return you get paprika, cinnamon, saffron, sandalwood. All these luxury goods are suddenly flooding the Akkadian markets. And off the back of it, the Akkadian Empire became incredibly wealthy. But now, let's return to old Sargon. And by this point, he was getting on a bit, as Sargon himself recollects in a tablet detailing what is perhaps his own autobiography. Quote, "In my old age of 55, all the lands revolted against me. They besieged me in Agade, but the old lion still had his teeth and claws. I went forth into battle and defeated them. I knocked their vast armies over. Now, any king who wants to call himself my equal, wherever I went, let him go." Close quote. Could be said from this that even in his later life with his empire cemented, Sargon still faced the problem of rebellion. Because don't forget, even from the start in Sumer, he faced rebellion from all of Lougehrigse's old client rulers, and had to go forth and put them down. And so, at the age of 56, in the year 2279 BC, Sargon I, the Conqueror, the first king, the first emperor, in fact the first emperor in history, passed away, and left a flourishing empire, still in a state of rebellion though, to his son and heir, Rimush I. Now, not much can be said about Rimush, unfortunately, but his short reign was plagued with rebellion. Because once one ruler dies, and there is either a child heir or no apparent heir, or an heir, but a transition of power, the vultures always start to circle. And in this instance, it was those sneaky old Sumerian client rulers again. And so for Rimush's short 9-year reign, he had to go on another journey of conquest. Not like his father conquering new lands, but instead reconquering Sumer. Now isn't that boring? I'm only joking, of course. No, it was to put down rebellions being staged by the client rulers of the Sumerian cities, who all wanted to assert their authority and independence over their own lands, without some old man in Akkad governing and telling them all that they had to do. Rimush successfully put down these rebellions. However, like I said, his reign was short-lived. He only ruled for 9 years, until the year 2270 BC, when he too joined his father and died. The lineage next passes to Rimush's brother, Sargon's other son, who goes by the name Manishtusu. Again, not a lot is known about this son of Sargon, other than he ruled for 15 years after the death of his brother Rimush, meaning he had a slightly longer reign than Rimush, but like his brother, it was probably most likely plagued by rebellion in the region of Sumer, with those old client rulers still trying to assert their authority and independence over what were once their own lands. But so, Manishtusu, after 15 years on the throne of the Akkadian Empire, like his brother and father before him, passed away in the year 2255 BC. But now, we go on to Sargon I's grandson, who is perhaps accredited with an Akkadian golden age, the true height of the Akkadian Empire. In 2255 BC, Sargon I's grandson, simply known as Narim Sin, ascended to the Akkadian throne, and he would take what his grandfather and father had left him, and he would expand on it and take the Akkadian Empire to new heights of wealth and glory. But like his grandfather, his father and his uncle before him, Narim Sin had the problem of rebellions within his empire upon the death of the previous emperor. Maybe once more it was those pesky old Sumerian city-states kicking up a fuss once more and again trying to assert their dominance over the region that they had long now inhabited. But no, it seems this, you could say, was perhaps an Akkad Sumerian tradition. One emperor dies and hey, let's all go rebel to celebrate the new king ascending to the throne, shall we? Yeah, it'll be a blast. Well, we can't say that's why they all rebelled. That's just me being an idiot again. But in any case, Narim Sin once again had to go on a journey of conquest within his own regions, within his own lands, just as his grandfather, his uncle and his father did before him when they ascended to the throne of Akkad. And then, and only then, once his region had been re-stabilised through a brutal suppression of rebellions across his empire, he could finally begin to govern properly and steadily. As you'll know, that any nation or empire needs, it's a steady, stable and strong ruler who is able to keep a grip on things, whilst not losing everything he has already. And I'm sure you've all heard the saying that genes and traits tend to skip a generation. Recessive genes, I believe they're called. And it seems that Narim Sin had inherited the ambition and drive of his grandfather Sargon I. For once everything in his region and empire was secure and stable, once he had stabilised everything he already had, he, like his grandfather, turned once more towards the looming and beckoning horizon that was the borders of his empire. For like Sargon, he would go on new conquests to new lands. Now, you must know that when the Akkadian Empire was at its height, it too, like any great power you'll see throughout history, had rivals. These were Elam, to the south of the Akkadian Empire in what is now southern Iran, centred around the Persian Gulf. Elam and Akkad shared a border near what is now modern-day Kuwait. And, like any time in history, when two sizable powers share a border, or share ambition, or share the same objectives, they will tear the absolute life out of each other. But in Narim Sin's case, he got there first. Perhaps to keep his own borders and interests safe, or maybe just to have yet another area of land to rule over, Narim Sin waged war against the Elamites. He ended up defeating them, and took their land as a vassal state, a state which, in essence, would pay homage, or basically a puppet state. Now, a puppet state is easy to explain because obviously there is a puppet master controlling the said puppet state. In this case, it was the Akkadian Empire as the puppet master, and Elam as its puppet. With that out of the way, Narim Sin could turn his attention north towards Syria, Anatolia, and perhaps what we know today as the northwestern regions of modern Iran. Well, now I must say, just looking at a map and examining how the Akkadian Empire spread, just not only shows you how big the Akkadian Empire was, but how big Iran is today. Christ, you never really think about it until you start talking about it, I guess. Well, anyway, in any case, there were tribes now in these territories along what would one day become the Iraqi-Iran border. These tribes were known as the Hurrian Kingdoms. These tribes were perhaps a problem, or it could have been again that Narim Sin's ambition stretched towards the north and the Hurrians just happened to be in his way. We don't know for sure why he invaded the Hurrian kingdoms, perhaps to expand his influence, to secure yet another part of his border. No one knows for sure. But interestingly enough, there sits in the Louvre in Paris at this very moment a victory stele made in the Akkadian Empire under Narim Sin himself, detailing his victory over a people known as the Lougehrigse. Now I hope I'm pronouncing that right, sorry if I'm not, but this one is quite particular because the victory stele is perhaps maybe the only documented evidence we have of Narim Sin's conquests other than his conquest of the Elamites. Now these Lougehrigse were led by one of the Hurrian kings known as Satuni. This is perhaps one of the only Hurrian kings that we know by name, simply because of the victory stele that sits in the Louvre. However, it occurs that maybe all of his conquests went to his head. For you see, Narim Sin would, after his conquest, often begin to style himself as a god among men, equal to those in the Sumerian pantheon of gods, who were still very prominent even in the Akkadian Empire, even on par with Enlil, king of the Sumerian pantheon of gods. It is said then that this was perhaps the reason for the downfall of the Akkadian Empire. For you see, it's often told in ancient histories in particular that when a man styles himself like a god, shows this broad arrogance and perhaps even ignorance, bad things begin to happen. Now, I'm not saying that bad things continuously happened in ancient Egypt, but pharaohs, for example, often styled themselves as gods, ruling over men, equal to the sun god Ra or the god of death Anubis, for example. I'm just using this as an example. I am getting off track, I know, but it's just a good example. Now, perhaps, and you have to remember here that Enlil did not know the meaning of the phrase anger management. Remember, he swept all of mankind away in a flood because they woke him up from his afternoon nap time. So, people would say after the death of Narim Sin that the fall of the Akkadian Empire was due entirely, or maybe partly, in fact, due to Narim Sin's arrogance, how he dared to call himself a god, how he dared to compare himself as an equal to Enlil, the great king of the Sumerian pantheon. And the audacity of it. Get this for a self-styled title. Okay, so Sargon I, Narim Sin's grandfather, styled himself simply as the King of Kish, the city where he overthrew the king that he once served as Cupbearer. Now, Narim Sin, you could say, dialed this up to 11. Now, if this isn't punching a god in the face, I don't know what is. Narim Sin, and wait for this, styled himself as the king of the four corners and the universe, as in the four corners of the earth. He styled himself king of the world and the universe. He more or less just spat in the face of his own god, his own religion, and maybe to an extent his own people, because back then it was believed that if you piss a god off, they'll come for you. In one way or another, flood, drought, famine, war, disease, it doesn't matter. You piss a god off, they're out for blood. Or at least that's what people back then truly believed. Well, without science, it was the only explanations they had for such natural disasters and things that would often occur. Now, maybe the fact that people were a bit wary of this new title choice perhaps points us in the direction of maybe people were beginning to doubt the strength and confidence of their rulers, of Sargon of Akkad's dynasty. Of course, the empire was strong at the time when Narim Sin ruled. He reigned for 36 long years in total. Now, at this point in history, that is a bloody long reign. Now, the empire had reached new heights. It had established trade networks as far as India, with the newly formed Egyptian kingdom, with the pharaohs, trading in items such as lapis lazuli, silver, bronze, spices, wood and stone for building. And in return, the Akkadian Empire would give wheat, for it was a breadbasket, don't forget, sitting on all those waterways. However, it seems not even trade and wealth can keep you safe. In fact, it may even lead to your downfall. For money, yes, money and wealth can be a blessing, but secretly, it hides under its cloak of temptation as your true worst enemy. If you think about it really hard, then it makes sense. I mean, you can compare it to everyday life. If you think about it, money is your worst enemy and also your best friend. It's strange how that works, but it makes sense. And perhaps that is maybe one of the reasons for the Akkadian Empire's eventual downfall. But let's not get into that yet. Let's instead talk more about Narim Sin, his achievements, and what he did throughout that awfully long reign of his. And with all these conquests, all these achievements, the trade networks being set up, the empire being taken to new heights of territorial expansion, trade links, everything that made the Akkadian Empire great, you could say that Narim Sin, in his own way, was an incredibly successful ruler. He managed to consolidate his rule by reconquering the rebelling city-states, and he did so effectively, for his region was secure enough for him to campaign against the Hurrian kingdoms and the Elamites all within one lifetime. I believe Kramer actually describes and summarises the achievements of Narim Sin through his conquests best of all. Quote, Narim Sin raised Agaday to new heights of power and glory. His military successes were numerous and prodigious. He defeated a powerful coalition of the rebellious kings of Sumer and the peoples from the surrounding lands. He conquered the region to the west as far as the Mediterranean Sea and the Taurus and Amanus ranges. He fought and conquered the Lalubi in the northern Zagros ranges, and commemorated his victory with a magnificent stele. He conquered and turned Elam into a partially Semitized vassal state, where he built numerous statues and buildings in the city of Susa. Close quote. With a long list of achievements like these being described in a way such as that, it perhaps helps persuade you that Narim Sin at this time was simply unstoppable. He had secured his borders, prevented further internal rebellions, and even built upon the propaganda that his grandfather and father had started to develop by calling himself a literal god on earth, equal to Enlil, king of the Sumerian pantheon. But, like Sargon, Narim Sin was but a mortal man, like the rest of us. And at the end of a very long reign for the time, lasting nearly 4 decades, in the year 2223 BC, Narim Sin, the 4th king of the Akkadian Empire, died presumably of natural causes. Now, this wasn't the end of Sargon I's dynasty, for in our story of the Akkadian Empire, there is one last king-emperor. Now, he ascended to the throne the same year his father Narim Sin died, 2223 BC. This new king and heir to the throne was known as Shar-Kali-Shari. And once more, as was tradition as we're familiar with in the Sumerian regions, Shar-Kali-Shari began a campaign of conquest within his own borders. Those pesky old Sumerian kings and city-states, and perhaps more peoples now given the Akkadian Empire's great size, were up in open rebellion. Alright boys, grab your swords, we're going on another rebellion put down. So Shar-Kali-Shari, like his predecessors before him, set out on a journey of conquest to bring stability to his region, to his empire. But this time, things were quite different. It's often the way in history for when people fly high above the sky, without noticing it, being blinded by adrenaline, arrogance and power and possibly even ignorance, they simply fly like Icarus, too close to the sun. And it seems the Akkadian Empire had begun to fly so high, too high in fact. For unlike his predecessors before him, who had managed to put down rebellions and uprisings with ease at the beginning of their reign and quickly get on to the interesting stuff, conquering new territories, setting up more trade links and networks with far-flung lands, this time Shar-Kali-Shari had great difficulty in putting down these rebellions. In fact, it was becoming a bigger strain on the Akkadian economy now. Because around this time, and as fate would have it, drought had begun to strike the Mesopotamian region, the heartland, the home of the Akkadian Empire. The very thing that made the Akkadian Empire so prosperous, the ability to sell the stockpiles of wheat that they had left over to keep trade going, suddenly lost its baseline. And with no baseline, like a house built on a hill of sand, the Akkadian Empire began to collapse under its own weight, under its own size, and under its own new economic burden. Because in order to police all these far-flung regions, to govern them, you needed the money to crush rebellions, you needed money to crush uprisings, and you needed money, most importantly, to pay your armies to keep outside enemies at bay. And now, Shar-Kali-Shari, the great descendant of Sargon I himself, could not even put down localized Sumerian kings without incurring great cost. I believe Leek puts it best, the slow disintegration of Shar-Kali-Shari's empire from under him. Quote, "Despite his efforts and successful military campaigns, he, Shar-Kali-Shari, was not able to protect his state from disintegration, and after his death, written sources dried up in a time of anarchy and confusion." Close quote. With an empire as big as his, Shah Kali-Shari now had an increased responsibility to keep his borders secure and stop his rivals from rising up and crashing down on the empire. He waged almost constant war against Akkad's old enemies, the Elamites, the Amorites, and just as the sun was setting on the Akkadian Empire, a new threat emerged on its borders: the Gutians, a nomadic people who would bring about the final killing blow of the Akkadian Empire. And it could not have come at a worse time for the Akkadian Empire, because you see, a spout of climate change had begun to take hold in the Mesopotamian region. A severe drought had occurred. With no food being produced and therefore nothing to sell, the Akkadian Empire was fast losing money. It couldn't trade effectively, with its core source of income now being whittled away piece by piece. And eventually this would lead to a great famine within the empire's borders. And with famine comes fear, the uncertainty of there being no food, and with that comes anarchy. So with internal rebellion, you can't keep your state functioning properly. And that is when the opportunistic enemies from outside, the vultures if you will, begin to circle. The newest of these vultures were the Gutians, who, seeing the empire's weakness through lack of food, invaded the Akkadian Empire around the end of the 23rd century BC. What we know of the Gutians so far is their name, the Gutians, and from the rough area of where they came from, around the Zagros Mountains. Now, it's ironic, seeing as Narim Sin, the king that came before Shah Kali-Shari, had led a conquest into this region to defeat the Lougehrigse, one of the Hurrian peoples. But now, seeing as a people from that very same region had begun attacking and even invading the Akkadian Empire, signalled that the Golden Age had ended, and that the Akkadian Empire was now past its prime in the hands of Shah Kali-Shari. And so, in 2193 BC, Shah Kali-Shari, the last king of the Akkadian Empire, died, and it seems he took his empire with him. For afterwards, throughout the region there was internal strife, constant warring, fighting, struggles over who would take over the throne of the region from this last descendant of Sargon I. Some claimed to have descendancy from Sargon himself, pretenders arose, constant warfare, famine still lingered, and it seems that this triggered a Mesopotamian Dark Age, the Sumerian Dark Age it's sometimes called. For the written word, it seems, in the absence of a centralised figure, a form of authority, a governing body, almost seems to vanish entirely this far back in history. However, it seems that when talking about the legacy of the Akkadian Empire of Sargon and his dynasty, it seems that it didn't die out entirely, even though the written word almost disappeared after the death of Shah Kali-Shari. Maybe it can be seen that the influence of the Akkadian Empire over the area it controlled, at least, was impressionable to say the least, as it has been discovered that even as late as the 7th century BC, when the region of Mesopotamia had fallen under the Assyrian Empire, that stories of these magnificent rulers who had built a great empire were still being told. But don't forget, this was so long ago that to the people that retold these stories of Sargon's conquests of the feats of Narim Sin had passed simply into legend. In fact, people under the Assyrian Empire often retold these stories lumped together into one, simply as fables, fairy tales, stories. People at this time weren't even sure that Sargon and his dynastic line had even existed, it seemed, if they were being retold in epics, tales, fables and legends. However, it seems that even after the Akkadian Empire fell, the Akkadian and Sumerian languages seemed to have survived. Because even when the Babylonians began their conquest of the region, Akkadian and Sumerian were still languages that featured greatly in the culture and influence of Sumer. But it seems that the Sumerian city-states, the Akkadian Empire, the very first governments, kingdoms and empire would simply fade from the history records for an unimaginably long time. For when I say that these peoples were ancient, even the Romans, the Greeks, and even Alexander the Great, it is perhaps they didn't even know they existed. For it would only be until the year 1870 AD, as recently as then, that Sargon's name, his dynasty and his empire, his story, would re-emerge and be retold. For whilst excavating a site in Nineveh in modern-day Iraq, a man by the name of Sir Henry Rawlinson, whilst excavating a site in Nineveh, in the library of Ashurbanipal, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, sorry if I'm not, would publish the legend of Sargon and bring his name, his dynasty, his feats and doings back into the light of known history. And in 1936, we were given our first image of what Sargon I may have looked like when, in modern-day Iraq, in Nineveh again, after an excavation, a bronze figure of the head of Sargon I was found. I'm being serious, and I'm going to let you guys out there Google the image of this bronze figurehead. It's got an eye missing, but apart from this, it's the most complete representation of what we believe Sargon may have looked like. In fact, the influence that he and his dynasty held over the region was so powerful that, as Krivacek puts it, quote, "For at least 1500 years after his death, Sargon the Great, founder of the Akkadian Empire, was regarded by many as a semi-sacred figure, the representative and patron saint of all subsequent empires in that realm." Close quote. So even after Sargon's death, he was still regarded as a great figure. Even after the end of his empire, it seems a small number of people still clung to the memory of the Akkadian Empire. They even tried to find a reason for the collapse and downfall of the Akkadian Empire. For between the years 2000 and 1700 BC, we can't pinpoint the exact year when this was written, but a fable appeared known as the Curse of Agaday. It details how, when Narim Sin took to calling himself a god equal to the likes of the great Enlil himself, when he took to this, Enlil withdrew his favour from the city of Akkad, capital of the Akkadian Empire, and without the favour of the gods, the city of Akkad, and even the empire itself, no longer had the divine protection that it had long sought to gain favour among the Sumerian gods. and this weakness was why the Gutians decided to invade. That was the story that people could surmise, could find at least a reason to base around such a huge and heavy collapse of the First Empire. So as you can see, the Akkadian Empire, Sargon I, his descendants, Narim Sin and Shar-Kali-Shari, while they may not be well known to us, to the Western modern world, they perhaps started something that would shape the very history of, let's say, all of history to come after it. Because for as far back as we can remember through written records, through accounts, through images and sources that we find, there have been empires. From all the way back in Sargon's day, even as recently as the 20th century, and even to an extent during the years of the Cold War, there were empires. In fact, the concept of a nation having an empire, having glory and all that power to behold, that concept has only recently gone out of fashion. You could date between the years of 1990 and 2000 as the final, very end of the last couple of empires. So as you can see, the influence of the Akkadian Empire and its rulers stretches down even as recently as 50 to 60 years ago, without us even realising it. So it's plain to see that history has a hell of a lot more influence, a far more profound act than we first realise in our story. But for now though, I'm going to let you do some additional research on the Akkadian Empire, see what you can find, read up about it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading up about this empire, and it's fascinating to learn how one man can change the course of history and give birth to a concept that would be kept alive for millennia to come. But like I said, it's your turn to go and do some additional research of your own now. I'm Lewis of the Grand Portfolio, and thank you for listening.